Marissa thought she was looking at debris in the road. It was early, just past 6 in the morning, the kind of quiet that sits on rural roads before the rest of the world wakes up, soft light filtering through the tree line, no traffic, just the low hum of her engine and the sound of gravel ticking under her tires. She had driven this stretch dozens of times. It ran along the outer edge of a forest reserve, and she knew its curves well enough that something out of place caught her eye before she could name what it was. A dark shape, low to the ground, near the shoulder. She slowed down without thinking, and that's when she saw it move. It wasn't debris. It wasn't a log or a torn bag or anything her brain had already started cataloging. It was small, and it was alive, and when her headlights swept over it fully, her foot went to the brake so hard the car jerked to a stop on the gravel. It was a baby gorilla. He was tiny, far smaller than she expected, and he was lying almost completely flat near the edge of the road. His dark fur was matted with dust. His arms were folded underneath him in a way that looked less like rest and more like collapse. He didn't run when her car stopped. He didn't scream or scramble. He just stared, wide, dark eyes looking directly at the headlights without blinking, like an animal that had already used up whatever energy fear requires. Marissa sat behind the wheel for a moment, heart pounding, mind racing through everything she didn't know. She was not a wildlife worker. She was not a ranger or a vet or anyone trained for something like this. She was a woman who had stopped her car on an empty road at dawn and was now staring at a gorilla infant who looked like he was running out of time. She stepped out slowly, kept her distance, kept her movement small, and that's when she heard it. A faint rustle from the brush just off the shoulder, maybe 20 feet past where the cub was lying. She looked up, and she saw the mother. The female gorilla was partially hidden by the broken grass at the tree line's edge, her massive dark body pressed low against the dirt. At first Marissa wasn't even sure she was breathing. But then the gorilla's chest rose, barely, slowly, and one large hand shifted slightly against the ground. She was alive, but the way she was lying wasn't the stillness of rest. It was the stillness of something that had given up trying to move. Marissa's mind tried to make sense of what she was seeing. A mother gorilla, a dying mother gorilla, and her infant lying in the road close enough to the gravel shoulder that a single passing truck could have ended everything. The cub hadn't wandered away and gotten lost. He had stayed. He was right there beside her because he hadn't left, because to him leaving wasn't something that existed yet as a concept. She was his mother, she was his world, and his world had stopped moving, and he had stayed beside it anyway, in the dust, on the road, waiting for something he didn't have words for and wouldn't understand even if he did. That realization hit Marissa somewhere she hadn't expected. She crouched low and stayed still. She didn't approach, didn't speak yet. The mother's eyes were open, and even from a distance, even in that condition, her gaze moved first to the cub, then slowly, with enormous effort toward Marissa. There was nothing wild or threatening in that look. There was just something ancient and exhausted and aware. The cub made no sound. He dragged himself a few inches back toward his mother, moving on his elbows more than his hands, and pressed his small body against her forearm. The mother didn't pull away. Her arm shifted, not lifting, not strong enough for that, but shifting, just slightly in the direction of her infant. Even then, even like that, Marissa pulled out her phone and called emergency wildlife rescue. Her voice was steadier than she felt. She gave her location, described what she was seeing as clearly as she could, and was told to keep distance from both animals and wait for rangers. So she waited. She sat down in the dirt by the side of her car, close enough to watch but far enough not to cause more stress, and she talked. Not to anyone on the phone. Just softly, out loud, the way you talk to a situation when you don't know what else to do. She wasn't sure if the cub could hear her. She wasn't sure if her voice meant anything to him at all. But it was something to do with her hands and her breath while the minutes stretched out in the silence. The mother's breathing was getting shallower. Marissa could see it from where she sat. The rise and fall of her chest was slowing, spacing out. There were moments where it seemed to stop entirely before starting again, softer than before. The mother turned her head. It took visible effort, a slow, labored movement that seemed to cost her more than she had left. She looked at the cub, just for a moment, then she looked at Marissa, then back at the cub, then back at Marissa, and she held that gaze. There was no sound, no dramatic moment, just an injured, dying wild animal, in the dirt, at the edge of a road, looking at a stranger with something that felt unbearably specific. Marissa would not be able to explain it in any clinical way. She would not call it communication in any technical sense, but she would say later that she felt it like a weight being placed in her hands. Not a plea, not despair, something closer to trust. She pressed one hand flat against the road to stop herself from going in too soon. Everything in her body was pulling toward those two animals. but she stayed where she was, because the worst thing she could do right now was panic, either of them. Then she heard the distant sound of a vehicle, a ranger truck, still far off but coming. The mother heard it too. Her head lifted, barely, just an inch, and her eyes moved in the direction of the sound. The cub pressed harder against her arm, and for one strange suspended moment, the three of them were just there together in the early morning light. The rangers arrived 8 minutes later. They moved fast and professionally, which should have been a relief, and it was, but it also made everything suddenly real in a different way. Radios crackling, voices low and direct, someone immediately kneeling near the mother with a face that said everything before any words did. The lead ranger looked at Marissa and asked her to stay back. Then his team reached for the cub, and the cub refused to move. He did not scream. He did not fight or bite or throw himself backward. He simply gripped his mother's fur with both hands, small, weak hands that barely had the strength to hold on, and he pressed his face down against her arm and he stayed there. That was the moment that broke every professional composure in that clearing. Nobody said anything. The rangers worked carefully, voices low, movements slow, but the cub held on. Not in rage, not even in fear, exactly, in the way that small things hold on when they don't yet understand that some things can't be held. Silence in a baby animal is never a good sign. The rangers knew it. Marissa knew it, even without any training to tell her so. There is something instinctively wrong about an infant that doesn't cry, doesn't protest, doesn't make any sound at all when it's lifted away from everything it has ever known. Wild animals, especially young primates, are not quiet when they're frightened. They scream, they thrash, they make noise because noise is survival. Noise calls the mother. Noise says, "I am here, come find me." This cub made no noise at all. He was wrapped carefully in a blanket by one of the rangers, held close and low against a chest, his small face turned inward. His hands, which moments ago had gripped his mother's fur with every ounce of strength he had left, were now loose at his sides. His eyes were open. He wasn't unconscious. He was just somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't have a word for it in any human language, but that every person standing on that road recognized in their chest without needing one. Marissa watched the ranger carry him toward the truck. She watched the cub's face as he passed her, those wide dark eyes, unfocused, aimed at nothing, and she thought of the mother's look from minutes ago. The weight of it, the specific impossible weight of it. She glanced back toward the brush. The rangers working near the mother had gone quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when there is nothing left to do. Marissa turned away. She couldn't watch that part. She stood by her car with her arms crossed over her chest and she stared at the tree line until the sounds behind her stopped meaning anything she could identify. One of the rangers came over and took her information, asked how long she'd been there, what she'd seen, whether she had touched either animal. She answered everything on autopilot. Her voice was remarkably steady for someone who felt like the ground had shifted under her feet. Before she left, she asked about the cub, where he was going, whether he would make it. The ranger paused in that honest, careful way that people pause when they don't want to promise something they can't guarantee. "We're taking him to the rescue center. The team there is experienced. They've brought back animals in worse shape." He stopped. "We'll do everything we can." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either, and somehow that was enough to get her back into her car. She told herself she would go home, file it away, let the professionals handle what came next. That was the sensible thing. That was the appropriate thing. She was a bystander who had made the right call, and now the right call was to stay out of the way. She drove for 11 minutes before she turned around. The rescue center sat on a maintained property about 30 minutes from the roadside. It wasn't dramatic-looking, low buildings, covered enclosures, the kind of practical infrastructure that serious wildlife care actually requires. Marissa arrived not long after the ranger truck, still not entirely sure why she had come or what she expected to do when she got there. A staff member met her at the entrance, heard her explain that she was the one who had found them, and brought her inside without much ceremony. The veterinary team was already working. She was kept in a side room separate from the immediate medical space and told she could wait if she wanted. Through a window she could see part of the examination area. The cub was on a padded surface under soft lighting. A vet was checking hydration levels, examining him carefully for external injuries, monitoring his vitals. He lay still through all of it, not cooperative, not calmed, just absent in a way that was worse than struggling would have been. One of the younger caretakers came in to update her. Dehydrated, some superficial abrasion, no obvious broken bones. The biggest concern right now wasn't physical, it was neurological shutdown from acute stress. That was the clinical phrase. What it meant in plain language was that the cub's system had taken so much trauma in such a short window that it had essentially pulled inward to protect itself, and if it stayed there too long, the body would follow. He needs to stabilize emotionally before we can get nutrition into him properly, the caretaker said. That's the immediate priority. Marissa nodded like she understood, though the full weight of it landed slowly. Asked something she hadn't expected. Would you be willing to stay a little longer? Just nearby. He seemed to track your voice earlier when the Rangers had him. We don't know if it'll help, but right now we're trying anything that doesn't add more stress. Marissa looked through the window at the small, still shape on the padded surface. She said yes before she finished thinking about it. That would have been too much, too soon for an animal in shock, but they positioned her nearby, within earshot, and told her to just talk, quietly. Normally. Not to the cub specifically, just to talk, the way you'd talk if you were simply in the room. So she did. She talked about nothing. About the drive. About the morning light on the road. About the color of the trees. She felt slightly ridiculous. But every few minutes one of the vets would glance up and give her a small nod that meant keep going. The cub didn't respond dramatically. He didn't lift his head or turn toward her or do anything that would make a clean story. But once, just once, his eyes moved in her direction and stayed there for a few seconds before drifting closed. It wasn't much, but everyone in the room noticed it. By late afternoon, Marissa finally went home. She had been there for hours. She was exhausted in a way that went past tired, into something that felt like being wrung out from the inside. She ate without tasting anything. She sat on her couch and watched the light change through the window and tried to put the day somewhere manageable in her head. She couldn't stop seeing the cub's hands on his mother's fur. She couldn't stop seeing his face when he went silent. She went to bed early. Sleep didn't come. At 11:47 p.m. her phone rang. It was the rescue center. The cub had refused all formula since arrival. He had not settled. His temperature was dropping and his stress indicators were climbing, which in a compromised infant could cascade quickly into something that no amount of skilled care could reverse. They were doing everything medically possible, but something was missing in the equation, and they were running out of time to figure out what. The center was different at night, quieter in some ways, tenser in others, low lighting, the particular hush of a place where people are trying very hard and speaking in careful tones. A caretaker met her at the door and walked her quickly to a small room off the nursery area, warm, dim, smelling of clean fabric and antiseptic and something faintly animal. The cub was in a padded enclosure in the corner, awake. He had been awake, she was told, for most of the hours since arrival, not active. Just awake in that hollow, glassy way that looked less like alertness and more like the absence of sleep being the only thing his system still had control over. He was trembling slightly. His arms were folded against his own chest. One small hand pressed flat over his sternum, as though he was holding himself together from the outside. Marissa sat down on the floor, not close, not crowding, just down low where she wasn't looming, where she was small and still and non-threatening. She didn't reach toward him. She didn't make eye contact in any sustained way. She just settled herself into the space and started talking again, in the same low, even tone she had used on the roadside before the Rangers came. For a long time, nothing happened. The cub stared at the wall. His trembling didn't stop. A caretaker sat quietly in the opposite corner, monitoring, ready, not intervening. He turned his head, not all at once, slowly, the way a frightened animal moves when curiosity is just barely outweighing fear. His eyes found her in the dim room and stayed on her face. His trembling didn't stop entirely, but it changed, the sharp, jagged kind, easing just slightly into something smaller. Marissa kept talking, kept her voice level, didn't react too much, because reacting too much would have broken the moment like a thread pulled too fast. Inch by inch, one small hand came out from under his arm. Just one hand, reaching forward slightly from the edge of the blanket, not reaching toward her, not reaching toward anything specific, just out, into the air, as if testing whether the world was still there. The caretaker in the corner moved without making a sound, brought a small feeding syringe forward with practiced patience. And in that window, that small, fragile 2-minute window of the cub being just barely present enough to receive something, got enough formula into him to matter. Not a full feed, not a recovery, just enough. But in a night that had been trending only one direction, enough was everything. Recovery, when it finally came quietly, not in a single moment, not in any scene that would have looked meaningful from the outside. It came in small, almost invisible increments, a slightly longer feeding, a few extra minutes before the trembling started, one morning where the cub lifted his head when Marissa entered the room instead of waiting to hear her voice first. The staff tracked these things carefully. in notes and observations, because in trauma recovery the small things are the only honest measure of anything. But the center's lead caretaker had explained, carefully and without pressure, that the cub's nervous system was essentially rebuilding its sense of safety from scratch, and that consistency was the closest thing to medicine they could offer him right now. A familiar voice, a predictable pattern, something that showed up and didn't leave. So she showed up, under staff supervision, always, never pushing contact, never lingering past what the cub seemed able to handle. She learned to read the signs, when he was open, when he was overwhelmed, when the best thing she could do was simply be in the room and be boring about it. He began to settle faster when she arrived. He ate more reliably when the environment stayed predictable. He startled hard at sudden sounds, a door, a dropped item, anything sharp and unexpected, and needed time afterward to come back to baseline. The vets were clear about what this was. Not a personality quirk, not stubbornness. Trauma, behaving exactly the way trauma behaves in a young primate whose entire foundation had been removed in a single morning. He wasn't bonding because he had decided to trust humans. He was bonding because trauma had made him acutely, painfully sensitive to whoever stayed. And then, 3 weeks in, he got sick. A fever came on fast, the kind that shifts an animal's condition in hours rather than days. His appetite dropped to nothing. He stopped reaching for anything. He pulled back into that interior silence that Marissa recognized from the first night, and her stomach dropped the moment she saw it. She sat with him through 2 of those days, as much as the staff allowed, watched the vets work, watched him lie still under monitoring equipment with his eyes open and his expression blank. She asked every question she could think of, and got honest answers that were both reassuring and terrifying in equal measure. On the 3rd day the fever broke, but he didn't bounce back immediately. He stayed flat, stayed withdrawn, and Marissa found herself facing something she hadn't prepared for, the fear that the progress had been temporary, that what she had watched build over 3 weeks had been undone in 3 days, that the cub who had started reaching out was gone again, and this time the distance felt permanent. The lead vet sat with her in the small staff room and told her something she needed to hear. "This is what recovery actually looks like," she said. "It's not a line going upward. It goes up, it drops, it levels out, it drops again. Every setback feels like the end. Almost none of them are." Marissa held on to that, and slowly, over the days that followed, it proved true. Then one afternoon something happened that nobody had prompted, and nobody had planned. Marissa was sitting nearby during a routine care session when the cub, unprompted, moved toward her. Not fast, not dramatically. He simply closed the distance between them and reached out and placed one small hand against her sleeve. He didn't grip it, didn't pull, just rested it there and stayed. No food involved. No fear driving him forward. No reason except whatever reason a traumatized infant has for choosing, finally, to reach towards something living. The caretaker across the room looked up, met Marissa's eyes, and gave a single slow nod. Strength in a recovering animal looks different than you expect. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up sideways, in the way he started exploring the edges of his enclosure instead of staying in the center, in the way his eyes tracked movement with curiosity instead of alarm, in the way he began testing things with his hands the way juvenile gorillas are supposed to, pulling at textures, examining objects, interacting with the world like something that intended to be part of it. He was growing, not just physically, though that was visible too. Something behind his eyes had changed. The hollowness was filling in, and that was exactly when the hardest part began. The rescue center's protocol was clear, and it was right. The goal was never permanent human dependency. The goal was a gradual, carefully managed transition toward species-appropriate social contact, other rescued gorillas, proper primate companionship, a life that looked as much as possible like what his biology was built for. The team began reducing direct human contact in slow, deliberate steps. More time with the center's other residents, less one-on-one time with familiar caretakers, less time with Marissa. She had known this was coming. She had understood it intellectually from almost the beginning. The lead caretaker had been honest with her early on. The measure of a successful rescue was not how attached he became to humans, but how fully he could eventually live without depending on them. Knowing that didn't make it easier to sit in her car in the parking lot and talk herself into going home. The cub noticed the change in routine. Of course he did. His first response was protest, more agitation at transitions, longer times to settle, one difficult afternoon where he refused contact from anyone and sat alone in the corner of his enclosure with his arms folded inward, and Marissa, watching through the observation window, had to press her hand flat against the glass to keep herself from going in. The caretaker beside her said quietly, "He's negotiating with it. That's actually different from shutting down. He's upset because he knows what he wants. That's progress." Marissa nodded. She understood the distinction. It still cost her something to watch, but the caretaker had been right. Within a few days the cub began adjusting, tentatively, then more steadily. He started showing interest in the other gorillas, cautious at first, a lot of watching from a distance, the careful social reading that young primates do before they commit to anything, then closer, brief and exploratory, but real. The staff watched it happen with the particular quiet satisfaction of people who have worked a very long time toward a moment they couldn't guarantee. Marissa wasn't there for that day. She heard about it afterward and she cried in her kitchen for reasons she couldn't fully separate from each other. She was given one more visit before his transition to the next stage of care. A calm, supervised session, no agenda, just time. He was different, fuller somehow, more present in his own body. He moved around the space with a looseness that hadn't been there before, investigating things, ignoring things, existing with a kind of ordinary juvenile confidence that was the most beautiful thing she had seen in the entire month since that morning on the road. Then he noticed her. He stopped, looked at her the way he looked at things now, directly, with assessment, with recognition. He crossed the space between them without hurrying, and he placed his hand against her arm in exactly the same spot as before, and held it there for a long moment. Then he moved away, back to his own business, back to his own life. Marissa left the building holding herself very carefully together, and made it to the parking lot before she stopped. She stood in the afternoon light, and thought about a roadside at dawn, and a mother's last look and what it had asked of a stranger who almost drove past. That look had not been grief, it had been a handoff, and she had carried it all the way home.